Hello, teachers. My name is Kristen Hayes, and I recently conducted a research experiment where I looked into the most effective note taking methods. So, in my experience, often the administrators, when they come in and they observe me teaching, they really want me to use some form of a guided note sheet for the students to follow along with my slides and my lecture, just something for them to write as I'm talking and as they're learning. So I started to realize over the years that many of the students tend to find that blank space and fill it out immediately, and then they kind of go back into that, okay, I can relax for a minute and tune the teacher out for a few minutes until the next blank appears on the screen. So I wanted to look into what is the best way for the students to take notes, because I do agree that it's good to have something for them to write, but also I don't want them to feel like all they have to do is fill in this blank and kind of tune everything else out because all the information's on the piece of paper anyway. In my personal experience, I found that writing down things helps me to remember things, but that doesn't always work for everyone. So for my experiment, I wanted to find out if my students used notes that incorporated deeper thinking, more open-ended type questions, rather than just like filling in the blanks. So, the purpose of my study was to find the best methods of note taking while using guided notes. The students used only fill in the blank notes for the first half of our study, and then they switched to guided notes that had a very minimal fill in the blanks and mostly deeper thinking questions that ask questions relating to main topics within the lesson. So the students started with their notes, with the guided notes, the traditional fill in the blanks, and then they took a test. Most of the students did a really nice job on their test anyway. But then we started the next unit where the students had all types of notes with only open-ended, deeper thinking type questions, and maybe one or two fill in the blanks here or there, but it was mostly questions asking students to explain things that they had just learned from the slides. So the test scores after that were primarily higher than their test scores on the first round, on the first exam where they just filled in blanks. And I find that this is because the students had this incentive to listen to what I was saying because they needed to answer the questions. Um, Also, just so you know, the students did have time to answer the questions throughout the lecture. So once we got to a point where I finished explaining a concept and I wanted them to think about what was just said and then answer the question in their own words, then they had an appropriate amount of time to answer that question, and then they were told after a certain amount of time, okay, we're going to move on. It's not a big deal if you didn't totally finish everything. And then we moved on to the next part of the lesson where we talked again about concepts and terms, and then they did that again where they had time to answer a question that required them to really synthesize the information and write it out in their own way. So When I spoke with my students, they reported feeling a little more stressed during the lesson than they did when they had to fill in the blanks, but that was because they had to really follow along with the notes. But they also said, I feel like it does help me stay focused because I need to make sure I answer the questions properly, because they know that I will look at their answers and give them feedback. Another student said, I do feel like I understand the lessons more now that we have to answer questions when we take notes. And 67% of students reported that open-ended questions embedded within the guided note sheet was beneficial to them as a learner. And then a quote from some supportive research was that you should never literally copy an entire text. Explain it or write it out in your own words. Do something that makes it your own. And that quote stuck out to me a lot when I was performing this research experiment, because that's really what I was trying to go for with my students. That's what I wanted them to do, be the masters of their topic, and really show me that they understood everything that we were talking about. So how does this method of note taking, how does it improve the test scores? I found that it's because the students retain and understand concepts better when they synthesize the information that's taught. Embedding questions throughout the note sheets and checking the student work helps to provide them with incentive to be accurate. And when there's an incentive or student interest, even, students tend to retain more information. So I find for myself, if I'm interested in something, then I will do better at something that I'm not interested in. But if I have an incentive to learn something, if my grade will depend on it, or if my teacher will check what I've been doing, then also I have that same sort of motivation to complete the work properly and really listen. Some supporting research are other experiments and research papers that I've read through to help me with my research. One in particular was about student feedback on the teaching in schools and the perception of teaching and the teachers onto the students. So I found that to be very interesting and helpful when I was coming up with my theories and coming up with what I was going to really focus in on with my research. And just to let you know, if you have any questions, comments, you want to just have a chat, talk about some ideas on some other ways that you find or have found to be successful and useful for you in the classroom, I'd love to hear it. I really want to ensure the success of my students. And the purpose of this research is really just to try to find ways to help my students and help them do better in the class. And as you could see on the first test, they did well, but they did, in general, most of the students did do a lot better after the new method of note taking was implemented. This research was for a food science class, which is very heavy in lecture. So it was a really good class to practice this research on. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to email me. My email is on the very bottom of this page here. It's kristenshayes24@gmail.com. I'd love to have a chat with you. Thank you so much for listening to what I have to say about my research, and I hope you have a wonderful day.